Good evening, everybody. Hello, Mary Lou. I got your email. I will get back to you. And Andy and Leslie, I'll dry the dishes if you want. So, good to see everyone this evening. And hi, Tom. Good to see you as well. Let's get right to it with the word of prayer. Lord God, we give you thanks for this day. Every day is a gift from you, and as this draws near, or this day draws to a close, we come that we might ponder the sacred words of long ago. We ask that your spirit be present in our speaking or typing as it may be, and even more so in our listening. And we ask this to our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, so this evening we are going to be looking at the story of Noah and the ark. And I just noticed that our numbers have dropped very quickly, so I hope this is still streaming live. Interestingly enough, many ancient cultures have a story of a flood. And the Babylonians, for example, still here, good, thank you. The Babylonians have a flood story called the Gilgamesh epic. And what that suggests to me, anyways, is that there was some great disaster back then, which was known to many people in many different cultures. And there are some who argue that Noah wasn't an actual person. I tend to take the opinion that it's possible that he was a real person. Whether the story has been embellished is another matter altogether. But a lot of biblical scholars treat this part of Genesis, actually right up through the end of the Noah story, as what they call prehistory, and that the actual historical part of the scriptures begins in chapter 12 with the arrival of Abraham. So why don't we get right to it, and I will share with you this reading.
The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals, and creeping things, and birds of the heavens. For I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence, and God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth, 50 cubits, and its height, 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark, and finish it to a cubit above, and set the door on the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind, 2 of every sort shall come into you to keep them alive. Also take with you every sort of food that is eaten, and store it up. It shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. Genesis.
All righty. So, what do you all think about this passage from Genesis? I find my mind going in lots of different directions. And a couple of things that stood out to me was the very beginning where it says that they did evil continuously. And that raises the question, what is evil? And is evil simply sin magnified many times, or is it quantitatively different? We're all still inbred. Well, makes you wonder if Adam and Eve had 2 sons, where did they get their wives? And yeah, it raises all kinds of issues and questions. But I look at the question of evil, and I tell people that I don't believe that there's a little guy out there with a pitchfork wearing a red suit with horns and a tail. But I do believe that there is a force, a power of evil that can take on a life of its own at times. Otherwise, how do you explain what happened in Germany in the years leading up to World War II? Evil is different. Premeditated cruelty, okay? But I can do something sinful and think about it before I do it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's evil. But I agree with you, Tom. I don't think that evil is simply sin magnified umpteen times. So in other words, it isn't quantitatively different than sin, it's qualitatively different. Okay, a lot of people will use the example of World War II and the death of the 6 million Jews. Okay, well, I would make the argument that even one Jew who is killed because somebody thinks that they're bad and that the world is better off without them, that too is evil. So evil isn't just the size or the scope of something that's been done that's bad. It's qualitatively different than sin. So, for example, if I an example I use is if I'm driving down the street and I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing, and because of that, I don't see someone walking across the street in the crosswalk, and I hit that person, and that person dies. I've done something sinful, but that isn't necessarily evil. In fact, I would make the argument that something like that isn't evil. But if I'm driving down the street and I see somebody in the crosswalk who is Black, or I know is gay, or is an immigrant, or even a drug dealer, and I say to myself, you know what, that person the world's better off without them, and I put my foot on the accelerator and I deliberately hit them, that's evil. And so the way I always describe it, for myself anyways, is evil is when you try to take something that is wrong and make it into something that you think is good, or you try to convince people that it's good. And in that example, deliberately running someone down because they're different and thinking that I've done the world a good thing, that's evil. Uh, so the story of Noah and this evil continuously says in my mind that things were really, really bad. But let's go a little further than that. It also says that God regretted making human beings. I find that rather bizarre. God regrets. That almost gives God a human quality. So here's another thing too. If we take this story, so people are bad, and let's, for the sake of the argument, say that everybody on the face of the earth was bad and evil except for Noah and his wife and their three sons and their wives. And let's say everybody else on the face of the earth, all human beings, were evil. And God says, you know what? I got to start over. Why do all the other living creatures suffer? Why would God make the cows and the sheep and everything else die? So this is one of the reasons why I don't think, at least for me, you can't take scripture literally word for word. And I know that there are some who would say that that is blasphemous, but I think you have just as many problems if you try to take everything word for word. Exactly, Andy. How can God love everyone and also regret making man? And here's another question. So if God made us and we turned out evil, does that mean that God made a mistake in making us in the first place? And if God created us and we were good, how did we end up so bad? So, you know, this story, if you take it literally, creates all kinds of problems. And it also raises the question of a vengeful God. Um, now, so yeah, Tom, you raise a good point. Is this a parable or an allegory? And my answer is to say that this is a story that evolved out of something that apparently was well known through the ancient world, that there was this legend of a great flood that destroyed everything. And I think what happens is people try to make sense. When something bad happens, they try to make sense of it. Okay. Bad things just can't happen. There's got to be a reason for it. And uh, you see this all the time when someone dies and they say, oh, well, God must have a plan. Um, and you also hear it, why would God let something like this happen? And I'll give you an example of when we heard that was back in, um, oh my gosh, I can't even remember the year, when we had the tsunami the day after Christmas, and about a quarter of a million people died all around the Indian Ocean. And people wondered, why did God let this happen? And there's got to be a reason for it, because bad things just don't happen to good people. And we talked about that a few weeks ago, or maybe a couple months ago, when we were looking at the book of Job. Job's friends said, Job, look, God doesn't let bad things happen to good people. So there's got to be a reason why all these terrible things are happening to you. And Job says, no, I didn't do anything wrong. And the friends, of course, say, well, everybody does things that are wrong. You're not perfect. And the fact that you think that you didn't do anything wrong proves that you're full of pride. And, Job says, okay, I'm not perfect, but I didn't do anything to deserve this. And, as a pastor, I can tell you that when something bad happens, human nature being what it is, they want to understand why it happened. There's got to be a reason for it. Why God? Look at the psalmist. I have to go back and check which psalm it is, but in one of the psalms, the psalmist cries out, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" I can understand that. There are times when life gets the best of me, and I want to say, why, Lord? Are you going to forget me forever? Look at Jesus on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And think about it. If Jesus was God's son and the incarnation of God, and he's feeling that way, even though he knows that that's not the reality, that God hasn't forsaken him, it's understandable why people would say, why, oh Lord? So I'm going to stop and look at some comments here. Yep, Jesus did say you will have troubles. Andy, I was going to say it was 2004. And so, if something bad happens to you, then there's got to be a reason for it. Because bad things just don't happen to people. And, my answer to that question is, oh, yeah, they do. Bad things happen. And sometimes the answer to the question, why, is because. It just happens. I found myself in that situation when my mother died, oh my gosh, probably about 15 years ago at this point, in a snowmobile accident. Why? I never asked that question, because I know that sometimes bad things just happen. And so the story of Noah, I think, is if this terrible thing happened, there had to have been a reason for it. And the God I know doesn't run around causing terrible things to happen. They just happen. It's part of free will and the gift of life. Now, there is another aspect to this question, though, or this story, which is, does God punish us? What do you think? Does God punish us? I'm thinking of different things that are going on right now. This virus, is this God's way of punishing us for our selfishness, our inhumanity to each other? And I was just thinking of William Sloane Coffin, And William Sloane Coffin was pastor of Riverside Church in New York City. Big, if Protestants ever had a cathedral, it would be Riverside Church in New York City. I've been there and it is an amazing place. And he gave a sermon once, and this was during the time of the outbreak of the AIDS crisis. And if you remember back then, there were Christians, some Christians, who were saying that this was God's punishment, that this was, I remember them saying and calling it the gay plague, that this was God's punishment for a deviant lifestyle. And William Sloane Coffin, in a sermon, took aim at that thinking, and he said that he did not believe in a God who engaged in germ warfare. And I have to give him guts. I would never have the guts to say this in a sermon, but in this particular sermon, which is a collection of a little book collection of his sermons called the Courage to Love. And he said that if the AIDS epidemic was God engaging in so-called germ warfare, then the least God could do is give slum landlords herpes. Stop and read a few things here. My goodness. Rain falls on the just and the unjust. Okay. Yeah, popular evangelical. Ah, you've read it, Tom. Yeah, it is a good little book. So, I look at, so let me rephrase this question a little bit. Maybe instead of saying, does God punish us? Would it be fair to say that God holds us accountable? And it's easy to say that God will hold us accountable in the final judgment, but does God hold us accountable here and now? And if so, what does that mean? Certainly in the story of Noah, we have an image of a God who does hold us accountable. And while I don't subscribe to the vengeful God who is just waiting to send plagues and whatnot upon us, does God hold us accountable? And what does that mean? My answer is yes, God does hold us accountable. And a lot of times that's seen in, to use the expression, letting the chips fall where they may. Oh, interesting, Andy. God holds us accountable with our conscience. And what about people who don't have a conscience anymore? If we have faith and a conscience, we are accountable. But the first thought that goes through my mind is that suggests to me that God holds us accountable via a guilty conscience. But is it more than that? Is it just having a guilty conscience that holds us accountable? And absolutely, having a guilty conscience can make life a living hell. But does God holding us accountable go further than that? And I would say it does. I think that, well, I'll give you a story. And I was a much younger minister didn't know as much as I do today about a lot of things, frankly. But I say that because I went to visit an elderly woman who was dying of lung cancer. And I walked into her kitchen and she was sitting there, and her cancer slash emphysema had progressed so much that she was on oxygen. And this is where I was young and naive. Never really occurred to me that it probably wasn't a smart thing to be sitting in a kitchen with a woman who was on oxygen and smoking a cigarette. But in any event, there I was. And as she was literally sitting there dying of cancer and smoking a cigarette, she said to me, "What to say in a situation like that? How would you respond to a statement like that?" Regret. Yep. Yep. And regret regret can really do a number on you. Absolutely. With this woman who looked at me and said, why does God let things like this happen? The unpastoral part of me is thinking, are you serious? You've smoked cigarettes all of your life. And you're wondering why God let this happen. I mean, having faith, does that mean that you get this magic bullet that protects you against this? And by the way, since we started on a note of what is evil, here's an example of evil. The cigarette companies that knew for decades that their product was killing people. And they kept telling us, no, the science doesn't support that at all. And, there's a part of me that says, I think they paid over $500 billion in a settlement. And part of me says they get off cheap. Or look at the fossil fuel oil companies that are telling us that the proof is not conclusive that fossil fuels are causing climate change. And you're not hearing as much of that anymore, thankfully. But when they were saying that, my response was to always say, brought to you from the same scientists who told us that cigarette smoking doesn't cause cancer. So letting people die because, to tell the truth, would be bad for profits, that's evil. And, here's the thing, it's God. I think God punishes us sometimes by just allowing our own deeds to play out and bring about the consequences. Teflon did it too. Oh, I'll have to read about that. And then there's the whole thing with Johnson's baby powder and is it DuPont or Monsanto's Roundup? That's all evil. And people who suffer like that, they are victims. And all of that isn't them being punished, but I do think that sometimes God's punishment is to allow us to suffer the consequences of our own decisions. And that woman who was sitting in that kitchen asking why, you know, it was God simply allowing the consequences of her actions to play out. But at the same time, I think that God's heart was breaking to know that this woman was suffering. And in some respects, it's almost like a parent. You have to let your kids learn the hard way sometimes. And so I look at God's punishment, and I think I like to say it as God allowing us to be held accountable for the decisions that we make. Watch Dark Waters. I'm guessing that has to do with Teflon, and I never knew that there was an issue with Teflon. I'm just gonna go here and check one other thing here. So I do believe that God punishes us, but the punishment is really from ourselves. And I was just thinking there's a saying that goes like this, that we always need to remember that the gates of hell are always locked from the inside, not the outside. In other words, that God doesn't put us in hell. We put ourselves in our own living hell. And God doesn't lock the doors, that we can always open the door and come out. But in order to do that, we have to come face to face with our behavior, our attitudes, our actions, whatever we did that put us in that living hell in the first place. And yeah. Anything else about this story that strikes you as unusual or makes you wonder? By the way, anybody know what story comes immediately after the story of Noah and the ark? And while I'm at it, I'll throw out another question. So it says that the ark was to be 500 cubits. I think that 500 cubits in length. And although he is disgraced these days, Bill Cosby, you may remember his famous comedy routine about Noah. And God tells him, I want you to build an ark. I want you to make it 500 cubits by 40 cubits by 30 cubits. And Noah then replies, yeah, right. And then he says, what's a cubit? Cain and Abel. Nope, that's much earlier, Tom. So anybody know what a cubit is? It was actually a measurement, but it was actually an accurate measurement. A cubit was the length of a man's arm from his elbow to the tip of his middle finger. That is what a cubit was. So I would guess, but this is why it was inaccurate, is because someone who's taller has a longer arm, so a cubit for them would be longer than, say, a cubit would be for me. And we talked about Bill Cosby, and here's a perfect example. Here's a guy, he was adored by millions of people, very wealthy, self-made. He came up through poverty to be a very wealthy and respected person. And then behind the scenes, behind the facade and everything, we see that there's this incredible sinfulness, which, reminds me that, there's good in the best, there's good in the worst of us, and there's bad in the best of us. Um, do I have any guesses yet on what comes after the story of Noah and the ark? I'll give you a hint. It has to do with something else that people built. Noah built an ark, and this next story has something to do with people coming together to build something. And the it's sometimes referred to as the anti-Pentecost story. And it is the Tower of Babel. And it's always fascinated me that you have these two stories, one right after the other, which both involve people building something. Noah builds an ark, and people build the tower. The ark is considered good, the tower is considered bad. And in fact, God comes down and destroys the tower and confuses people's speech. That's where we get the derivative of to babble on. He confuses their speech so that it makes it hard for them to come together and do things like this. And why is God so against the building of the tower? Yep, Tower of Babel, exactly. And again, why is God so troubled by the building of the Tower of Babel? Think about it. God could say, "Oh, look at those people I created, and they're really coming together, and they're getting pretty good at some of this stuff they're doing. They're making this tower." But God has just the opposite reaction. And the reason why is, if you look at the story, it's the reason why they built the Tower of Babel. And it was to build a tower that would be as high as the heavens. And so it's basically people coming together and forgetting their place. And when God comes down and looks at this, God says, this is only the beginning. There is no end to what they will do now. And I love the fact that these two stories are together, because they both have to do with construction, technology, even though by our standards it was very limited. And the difference is the intent. Noah built the ark to preserve life. The Tower of Babel was built not to destroy life, but the intentions were not holy and respectful of God. And, the two stories being right together always reminded me that so much of the things that we have in life are neither good nor bad. If I were to hold up a $20 bill and say, is this $20 bill good or bad? The answer is neither. It's how it is used. If I have a hammer, that's probably a good example, talking about Noah and the ark and the Tower of Babel. If I have a hammer, is that hammer in and of itself good or bad? The answer is the hammer has no intrinsic moral value. It is just a thing. It's how the hammer is used that determines its relative value. So if I take a hammer and I use it to build an ark, to save life, or to build a Habitat for Humanity home. And by the way, that's why I chose this passage, because Stephen Mack and Amanda Lee are going to talk about how they got involved with our summer Habitat for Humanity trip. And, if you use that hammer to build a livable home for a working family that couldn't afford one, then that hammer has a goodness to it. But if I take that hammer and I use it to bash someone over the head, then it's being used in a way that is not holy. So again, it just reminds me that how I live my life, how I use the things that God has entrusted to me, determines their value. Oh, interesting, Andy. Yeah, one was ordered by God, the other was opposed by God. And now, as we've talked about it, you know why it was opposed by God. And yes, they were trying to reach the heavens. And, interesting enough, this circles back to the story of creation in Adam and Eve. And what was it that finally got Eve to eat of the forbidden fruit? To her credit, when the serpent says, eat of the fruit, he says, oh no, we've been told by God that we can eat of any tree in the garden except for the tree that gives the knowledge of good and evil. And so she tries to do the right thing, but the serpent continues. And the serpent then says, oh, he's just joshing you, because God knows that when you eat of this fruit, your eyes will be open and you will know the difference between good and evil, and you will be like God. Go back and look. That's exactly what it says in the story. And that is, I think, one of the core fundamental challenges that we have as human beings is we want to be more than who we are, or we feel we need to be more than who we are. And, sometimes happiness is found, I say, in mediocrity. So, I look at the story of Noah, and it's fascinating. By the way, one of the things I'll say is about 4 or 5 years ago, Hollywood came out with a movie about Noah. I think it was called Noah. Save your time. Don't bother. Like so many Hollywood productions, they take liberties. And I can remember telling the youth ministry when somebody asked me if I'd seen the movie and, was it accurate? And my response was, the only two things about the Hollywood movie Noah that came out a few years ago is the only thing accurate about it is that there's a guy in it by the name of Noah and there's a lot of water. So much of it takes such liberties that I can tell you, as a pastor, I was horrified, because I was sitting there watching this movie and thinking to myself, there are so many people who are going to watch this movie and think that this is the actual biblical story. And just now, in fairness, I will say that Hollywood came out with a movie about Moses. It was sort of a remake of the Ten Commandments, and this was probably about 3 or 4 years ago. And I sat there. In fact, we took the youth ministry to see it in the theater, and I will say that I sat there and I was very pleasantly surprised. I thought that it was biblically very accurate. And since I'm on my pedestal now as a movie reviewer, I will also say the same thing about the movie The Shack. I never finished reading the book. I got to the point where I found out that God was actually Aunt Jemima, and I said, "Oh, I can't take any more of this." And if you've ever read the book, The Shack, you'll know what I'm talking about. God is presented in this book as a very heavy set Black woman who's a cook. Um, but we took the youth ministry to see this movie too. And theologically, obviously, it's not based on anything biblical stories, but theologically, it is excellent. And that's one of the things that I always get nervous about is a lot of religious movies. They tend to have a very conservative, evangelical um, tone to them. In fact, that was my reaction when the youth ministry, we watched the movie God Is Not Dead. And while there are parts of it that I thought were very well done theologically, the ending of that was absolutely horrible. Somebody dies in a car accident, and you have these two religious people thinking it's a blessing from God because he accepted Jesus right before he died. And I cringed when I saw that. But anyways, I will stop my movie critics. Um, when we're back to meeting in person, though, I'd like to do some more gatherings where we watch some of Rob Bell's Numa um, videos. So again, I thank you all. We will not meet next Tuesday night. I am going to be taking a little vacation the week before Labor Day. And so I will miss seeing you all next week. But once we get through Labor Day, we will get back in the saddle and start tackling. By the way, if any of you have a Bible passage or Bible story that you would like us to tackle, feel free to send it along. And I would be happy to delve into it with all of you. So God bless. Everyone stay safe. And we will see you all again.